Welcome, everyone. I'm Alison. I'm from the Southern Cross Postgraduate Association. A big welcome to everyone to this workshop with Patrick Danaher, Writing an Excellent Critical Reflection. So a few things before I hand it over to Patrick is that, yes, we are recording, and I'll post the recording up to the YouTube channel. I'll post a link in the chat box. And also, I encourage you to become a member of the Southern Cross Postgraduate Association. It helps keep all these workshops going, and I'll post a link to that membership as well. So that's enough from me. Over to you, Patrick. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Alison. Really appreciate it. And good morning, everyone. And really looking forward to this session with you about writing an excellent critical reflection. All right. And really just to endorse the work that Alison and her colleagues do with the wonderful Southern Cross Postgraduate Association, sorry, Alison, which I think is absolutely terrific and really very impressive. All right, so I'd like to start with the acknowledgement of country. On behalf of Empowering Editing that I work for, we acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which we meet today, including the Jagera, Jayabal and Jawa people of the Toowoomba region, where we are located, and we pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. And each time that I do this, I like to have a different image. And this particular image is from, if you've been in Toowoomba, you may well know this wonderful place. It's the Gumby Gumby Gardens, adjacent to the University of Southern Queensland Toowoomba campus, and obviously a lot of native plants and so on, well signposted and beautifully curated and looked after and so on. So I can really encourage people to do that. Also, on the other side of the campus, we have the Japanese garden, which is very different, but also a place of peace and so on. So all right, so in terms of what I'd like to cover today, there are a number of different things, but basically what I want to do is to go through and to talk about, given that all of us come from different disciplines and professions and so on, and I'll be talking a little bit more about that in a moment. What I'm interested in doing in this presentation is talking about a couple of things. One is almost like the generic structure of a critical reflection. So that is, regardless of what professional discipline or even in many ways the assessment task, there are certain common denominators that make up a critical reflection task and response. And so I want to talk about some of those elements, but I also want to think about and reflect on the differences that go across disciplines and professions and so on. And I think that that is really interesting as well. And really, to me, the takeaway message from that is that it is absolutely possible and appropriate to learn the skills of writing a really good critical reflection, but also writing a good critical reflection resists the idea of any kind of cookie cutter approach or paint by numbers or whatever it might be. In other words, it really does depend on your individual engagement and contribution and voice, indeed your scholarly voice that I talked about in the previous presentation about literature reviews. So there's some of the things that I want to cover, including defining critical reflections, really importantly, looking at the different types of knowledge that make up critical reflection. And I think that understanding those different types of knowledge hopefully will help you to approach this task. Also, the attributes of critical reflectors, and then going on some examples from different disciplines. So I'm grateful to Alison for sending through where the participants today come from in terms of different disciplines from SCU and so on, which is terrific. And then to think about why academics set critical reflection as an assessment task. What is the thinking behind that? And if we can understand that, I think it helps us to approach the task as well. A bit of number 12 is a little bit of a provocation, I guess, so we'll see what people think about that. And then a little bit about how to write critical reflections. Now, I hope that I apologize if some of this is familiar to some of you already. I certainly hope that not all of this is already familiar to you. Otherwise, we'll see what happens. But equally, I hope that there's something that you can take away, or perhaps several things you can take away from this presentation. All right, so first of all, I really do want to acknowledge Alison, who's actually suggested the topic, which I think is terrific, and kindly shared some excellent resources beforehand, which is wonderful. To acknowledge the Postgrad Association and also to all of you as the participants. So a couple of caveats which are really important. And this is a variation on what I said last time about literature reviews for HDR students, but also for coursework students. But it's really important that it is really genuinely the case that there are many different ways that are equally legitimate that people can write critical reflection. So that's really important to bear in mind. And that's important to bear in mind too, because it draws on your own engagement with, contribution to, ownership of the process. Also, if there's anything in here that differs from what you've already been advised and so on, go with what your academic, what the academic lecturers and tutors and so on are teaching you, but perhaps consider what we're putting forward today. All right, so just a little bit about me. Previously, I worked at Central Queensland University and then University of Sunshine, Southern Queensland, sorry. I have an adjunct appointment at Sunshine Coast Uni, which is very nice. I'm currently working at Excelsior College in Sydney as a wholly remote worker. I'm very much a qualitative researcher. I have worked with some quantitative research with colleagues and so on. I'm also an education researcher, although I've worked with people in health and other disciplines as well. I have a particular interest in sociology of education, rural education, similar kinds of topics. And in terms of this particular assessment task of critical reflections, I am very interested in, from an educational, pedagogical assessment point of view, how different disciplines and professions approach the critical reflection, which in many ways operates as a kind of in some ways it's a signature pedagogy, or it can be in different disciplines, which really means that it links with the particular essential attributes of a particular profession or discipline. Now, I'll come back to that. That may just sound very grandiose or airy-fairy at the moment, but it's actually important, I think, in helping you to engage with what does critical reflection look like, whether that's in health or law or business or education, or whatever else it might be, social work and so on. All right, so what I'm interested in terms of the what we hope to cover today is I want to propose that critical reflection is a skill. It's a set of skills, particularly around writing, but also around thinking and organizing ideas and so on. And that is certainly a skill that I'm sure that you've developed and are continuing to develop. It's also a disposition, and a disposition really is it's a mindset or a set of attitudes. And I think that that's sometimes not exactly hidden, but that's less well understood or less explicit than critical reflection as a skill. And so the disposition really is, how do you approach the task? And I've got a few suggestions about how you approach the task. And then in terms of attributes, as we know, we have graduate attributes, we have other kinds of attributes. And so they're, in a sense, what Southern Cross University is striving to achieve, that you will have developed. You might have developed at the beginning of the course, but if not, certainly by the end of the course. So those three things intersect, but they're slightly different aspects of successful critical reflections. Now, this next one is not meant to be flippant. It might read a little bit like that, but it's not meant to be. But one person's critical reflection might actually be superficial to someone else. You know, we might say, oh, well, this is the best that I can do. And someone might say, well, stating the obvious. It's a bit like with HDR students. I'm not sure about SCU, but previously, the abstracts of the thesis were read out. Now, people had only 100 words or 200 words or something, their lifeblood in 200 words, and then inevitably it comes out as being well, that's kind of obvious. Or, is that what you did 3 years full time and that's what you found? So again, I'm not seeking to be flippant, but sometimes when we read our work, we can be very self-critical. So if you feel that your work is superficial, that's not necessarily the case. It may simply be the way that the lens that you're reading it with. But equally, a critical reflection may be incomprehensible to someone else. It might be highfalutin. It may be written in such an abstract kind of way that it has no particular meaning. Now, that may be disciplinary differences, but if you find that you share your draft critical reflection with a few different people, and they're people whose judgments you trust, and they say, the common message is, well, I'm sure it's very interesting, but I don't understand it. That's perhaps a sign that you need to go back to the communicative function of a critical reflection. And it's like anything, including a thesis. If we can't communicate what we're seeking to, well, our intended meaning, then we need to go back. All right. And yet it is certainly possible to develop it as a skill, but develops over time. It's not something that we can try in 10 minutes and then we've got it. Usually it takes time to develop and refine and reflect on and so on. All right, so I want to look at the language of critical reflection, and we'll look at a few different examples. I want to talk about some of the strategies for writing precisely and powerfully, and hopefully as a result of that, you may already have great capacity and confidence, which is terrific, in which case this will just reinforce that. Otherwise, it may increase your capacity and or confidence in writing an excellent critical critical reflection. All right, I thought about excellent. So, that can be seen to be very elitist, and so it's not meant to be. It's meant to be high quality, first class. It's really about fitness for purpose. So that when you write a critical reflection, typically that's within a certain number of words and all of that kind of thing. So there are those limitations that are set with the task before you even start it. Within those constraints, it is possible to write a critical reflection that is fit for purpose and does fulfill its intentions. All right, so a few definitions, and I should say, if I'm going too quickly, apologies, but I will share the slides afterwards with Alison, and so all will be well. All right, so interestingly, in terms of the dates, there's some really good tools around critical reflections that have been around for quite some time. So this one by Jacoby from 2010, I found really useful. And I think from memory, this is one that Alison kindly sent through. So if we just have a quick look at that. So critical reflection is really about making meaning out of a purposeful combination of experiences and academic content. And I want to come back to that from a few different angles. So it's combining our experiences, or sometimes other people's experiences, and academic content. Now, sometimes people will substitute theory or concepts or whatever it might be, scholarly knowledge for academic content. And I'll come back to types of knowledge in a moment. But in essence, that's what you're looking at. So you're bringing together different ways of understanding the world. And so it's meant to add depth and breadth. It's meant to challenge simplistic conclusions. It's meant to compare varying perspectives, to examine causality in disciplines where we accept that causality is, it is possible to identify and so on, and to raise more challenging questions. So if we just look at that for a moment, there's a lot of hard work being done there, cognitive work, but also affective work, our emotional investment in the process, and other kinds of work as well, technical and so on, in terms of the language use. And so if your critical reflection is, for 300 words, 500 words, 1,000 words, sometimes they're longer, they're full essays, of course. But within in terms of proportionality, there are some of the things that you'll be looking at doing. All right. More specifically, critical reflection involves analyzing, reconsidering, and questioning one's experiences within a broad context of issues and content knowledge. And so when we look at a task for critical reflection, that's really what it's asking us to do. So typically, if we just take for a moment that it's our reflection, our experiences, as sometimes, as I say, it's other people's experiences, but if we say that it's our experiences, the whole point about a critical reflection is that we understand more about that as a result of going through this process of our experiences, which otherwise may well remain unexamined or implicit or tacit or those kinds of things. So critical reflection from that regard is meant to be rigorous, it's meant to be systematic, it's meant to be transparent, it's meant to be something that we share with other people. Now, of course, in life, we reflect all the time. And usually that's with ourselves or with our family members or our pet dog or whoever it might be. But this is requiring something that's more systematic, that's more rigorous, that it typically uses formal language or sometimes a mix of formal and informal, depending on the genre of the task and so on. Now, interestingly, Jacobi goes back to John Dewey, and I'm sure many of you really like Dewey's work, particularly around experience and so on, a terrific philosopher. And so Jacobi very modestly said, actually, Dewey's definition from long, long, long ago of 1933 is the best definition that she has found. So Dewey said, critical reflection is the active, persistent, and careful consideration of any belief or supposed form of knowledge in the light of the grounds that support it and the further conclusions to which it tends. So that's very formal language from the 1930s, but basically it's to look at our experiences and to say, what's going on here? How do we make sense of this? How do we make meaning from this? And to push and prod at the experience to see what's its shape, what's its form, what's its significance. In some cases, what is its cause or what are its causes? And often, what are its effects? What are its implications? All right. Now, in terms of types of knowledge, so my very good friend and mentor, Michael Singh, who I think is retired now from Western Sydney University, introduced me to this typology, but unfortunately I can't find the reference for it. And he may have got it from elsewhere, but Michael kindly introduced me to it. And so if we just think for a moment, this is one way of thinking about the constituent types of knowledge of a critical reflection. And so one of those is theoretical knowledge, which, as we know, typically comes from generally published, often peer-reviewed concepts and theories. And so in your respective professions, whether health or education or law or business or social work or whatever it might be, clearly there is a disciplinary body of knowledge, or body of disciplinary knowledge, sorry. And typically that takes that kind of form. Now, each type of knowledge has strengths and limitations. For the theoretical knowledge, one of the strengths is it helps us to make connections with experiences beyond ourselves and beyond those close to us. And that's really important because we may have a sense that our experience is unique in the world, and it may be. We may have a sense that there's some, because they're the ones we know the best in this world, those close to us, that we may see resonances, synergies, but also differences in our experiences and theirs. But what good theory does is that it helps us to go beyond that to, in a quantitative sense, the whole population, and to say, what are the resonances between what we're experiencing and what others are experiencing, but also, are we different? Are some people's experiences outliers? Are they qualitatively distinctive or even unique? And so good theory does that. As we know, limitation of theoretical knowledge can well be that it's considered to be academic and disconnected from real life, in inverted commas. And that, of course, is where this distinction between experiential and empirical knowledge comes in. Now, I'll just explain for a moment. From Michael Singh's point of view, experiential refers to our experience because that's what we've had directly. And because unless we evolve as a species in some way, in 5,000 years' time, or maybe 100,000 years' time, or something, where we go beyond the ego, beyond the individual, beyond the personal, to some kind of shared direct experience. Until then, really, the only way I can understand the world directly is through my experience. And so that can be complex, it can be vivid, it can be recalled in great detail, but it can also be anecdotal and it can be superficial. And I'll come to what I consider the most significant quote for this presentation shortly. So if we think about that, so experiential knowledge has significant strengths, and it's actually key and crucial to critical reflection. But there are limitations, and that's where theory comes in, good theoretical knowledge. Now, from Michael's typology, empirical knowledge type really refers to other people's personal experience or other people's experiential knowledge. And sometimes that's gleaned from chatting with friends or family members or whatever. Sometimes it's reading, we all read the news in different ways. And so sometimes it's thinking, oh, I didn't know about that that particular experience, or there might be something about, I don't know, debates around school funding or whatever it might be. And we may just be reading not for the purpose of study, but just because we want to calm our minds or we're curious or whatever. So that kind of knowledge, empirical knowledge, other people's direct personal experience, can be picked up in all kinds of ways. Now, one of the strengths of that is what is sometimes called naturalistic generalizability, which is one of those academic terms. And really all that means is that some people, for instance, when they're writing a thesis or a research report, and it's a case of one, or it's a case study of 4 or 5 people. So some people are critical of that methodologically because they say, well, how can that actually speak to anyone outside that small group? This is where this idea of naturalistic generalizability comes in. And one indication of that is that if someone is reading your report, they're not in your case study, but they say, that was my experience, or I know someone that relates to directly. That's that kind of thing. In other words, there's a broader significance, resonance of the work. Similarly, on the less positive side, it can be anecdotal and superficial. So the reason that I'm spending a bit of time on this is that critical reflection actually brings together these 3 different knowledge types and builds on their strengths while reducing their limitations. Now, if we think about it, there are plenty of assessment items that would focus only on theoretical knowledge. And I'm sure you do them. And they may be exam papers, they may be online quizzes, or all kinds of assessment tasks related to that. And what the academic in the unit or course is interested in, do these students understand the concepts, the key concepts, the disciplinary knowledge? So that's really important. By contrast, critical reflection serves a very different purpose, which is to bring together that theoretical understanding and the personal or the experiential or the direct knowledge and so on. All right. Now, this is from Deakin University Library. It's not that I ignored Southern Cross University. I know your library is excellent, but I just wanted to make sure really that I was trying to draw in resources that you might be less familiar with. And I really like this quotation. And for me, this is the fulcrum of today's presentation. So some of you may have read some of Anaïs Nin's work and so on, an amazing author. But this, I think, is really profound. We don't see things as they are. We see them as we are. And I think that repays coming back to. So we don't see things as they are. We see them as we are. And so, and I'm sure you're familiar with this idea already, but, I guess in an ideal kind of world, an academic might say to the students, all right, go off and critically reflect, drawing on your own experience and bringing in some theoretical knowledge. And as I mentioned in the previous slide, experiential knowledge has considerable strengths. But this is another limitation of that because of the way that we are hardwired as a species, we perceive the world, we experience the world, we understand the world, we make meaning from the world. We have to do that in order to survive as an individual and as a species. but also to make our way in the world. And some people are very well versed with the notion that this is not the case, but otherwise we might go through life saying, well, that's my perception, so that's reality. That's the way it is, even for myself. But Nin's insight there actually highlights we see the world, we perceive the world, we experience the world in ways that are attached to our identity, to our personality, to our DNA, to all kinds of ways that are different from an external reality, if you like, an objective reality. So it doesn't diminish our self-perception, our self-experience, but it makes it more complicated. And it says that we need, as well as our own reflections that come through our own personality and so on, we need other tools to help us to do a good critical reflection. Okay, so these are some of these other tools. So it's active, not passive. It involves all three of these dimensions: thinking, feeling, and doing. Some people are very comfortable with thinking, but perhaps less so with feeling and doing. My slight provocation in a few minutes' time is really about the doing part. We'll come back to that. So a really important question is, what influences your practice? Where do those influences come from? And often they're things that you're doing in your course and so on, but they're often life experiences, including childhood life experiences, that sometimes we are aware of, but often we are not, unless and until we engage in this kind of activity. And so, because, as I said before, we need not just our own experiential knowledge, but we need theory and so on, then critical reflection involves research and an evidence base. And so really, it's summed up here. E equals mc squared, I think. Personal experience plus theory underpins reflective practice. So it's putting those elements together. All right, now, my apologies for the small font, but it's not really about reading the font. So for the next few slides, what I've done is to put together a few different examples from different professions of a critical reflection. And the first one is from engineering, and specifically design. And so as we go through these, what I would invite everyone to do, if this is your discipline, your profession, that's great. You can have a look and say, oh, well, that's easy, or I've just done that, or, oh, wouldn't have thought of doing that. But equally, if this is not your discipline, then I invite you to have a look at how a critical reflection task looks and feels in another discipline, another profession, and what that looks like. Okay, so I didn't put in the figure, but what was happening here was that individuals were working in teams, as often is often the case with engineering and design students. Sometimes it's for problem-based learning or project-based learning. I'm not sure the actual details here, but basically people were working in a group. But it started off with the individual's critical reflection activity. And so basically it was asking each student individually and separately and independently to I guess to look at where they've got up to in the process, and with as a kind of a launch pad for where to from here. And so the wording is really interesting in all of these exercises, but consider your own actions and mindsets. And also, I thought really interesting, empathize with those for whom you design. And so, in a sense, they're the end users or the clients or the customers or the consumers, or in our respective professions, patients, students, and so on. And so to think about this, who will benefit, hopefully benefit as an outcome of this project and so on. All right, and then these questions: your engagement with design phases and activities. How did the ways you've engaged in design affect the quality of the deliverables? How have you identified which research design phases and activities? And how have you helped your term appropriately identify and switch among design tasks and so on? And also consider your team's dynamics. How do you as an individual contribute to your team's effective function? Now, just for a moment, that's the individual critical reflection. But interestingly, there's a team reflective critical reflection. as well. And so these are meant to be done in tandem, starting with the individual response and then people conducting a collective critical reflection and so on. All right, and so that's meant to be a group. So the questions are, I guess, commensurate and consistent with the individual, which is good, but they also take account that this is a different dimension. And so the individual dimension and then the team or collective dimension. So the questions are somewhat different. Are we as a team working in a way that respects everyone, is equitable, values everyone's contributions, values everyone's learning? And then are we giving and receiving feedback? Are we effectively deploying design activities to complete the project and value each member's learning and so on? And what practices do we keep and how do we change practices in order to improve? So I'm sure that if you're not in engineering or design, I'm sure that you have also come across the notion of an individual and a collective dimensions of critical reflections. But I think it's interesting to have a look at that from design and engineering. All right, so this is from education, from early childhood education. And again, it's not so much looking at the individual questions, but really to get a flavor of it. And so clearly, for those of you who work in education, they should be very familiar. The notion is using critical reflection to reflect on the teachers, the early childhood educators' relationships with individual children, which, as we all know, whether we're educators or not, can be in a very complex contexts within the early childhood setting or center, but also it's complex because of the full range of stakeholders, including government and policy instruments and all kinds of things, and parents and caregivers and community members and so on. Okay, so from an education, early childhood education point of view, I thought it was interesting that they use the adverb creatively. So critical reflection is looking in detail and creatively, thinking about practice and program decisions, exploring multiple perspectives, making the links between theory and practice clear, which is wonderful because that's what we were just talking about, and making purposeful changes to practice. All right. And then these kinds of key questions, similar to what was done with design and engineering, but of course different for the for the context. What do we know about this child? Why do we make the decisions respond the way we did? Were we guided by our philosophy and theories about children's learning? How did we feel about the decision? What went well? What didn't go well? Should we continue, improve, or change? Now, in some ways, regardless of the profession or the discipline, those questions would be very useful to use as frameworks. But in other ways, they're distinctively educational, including, and this is sometimes quite difficult, having worked in education with pre-service teachers, in the final year, often the assessment is around what's your philosophy of teaching? And some people have, and also a portfolio of teaching. And some people have really developed what they regard as what is a genuinely felt and well articulated philosophy. Other people really struggle with that and say, I don't know, I'm just there to help the children to learn, or the students to learn, or to manage behavior. Or so their philosophy is perhaps more crafted in terms of functions or attributes of knowledge and competence and that kind of thing, which is absolutely fine. But for them, for some people, they really struggle with, so it's too philosophical, too theoretical, whereas other people love that. Now, one of the slides before said that critical reflection involves thinking, feeling, and doing. So I think it's useful that this one actually explicitly focuses on an exploration of feelings. What were my feelings when it happened? Why did I feel that way? How can I use those feelings to motivate change for myself, the team, and the service? Now, of course, in a different philosophy, or maybe even a different personality type, the very notion of feelings being involved in this kind of way would be anathema. People would say, well, your feelings shouldn't come into it because they make the processes subjective. And whereas the processes of reflection should be objective. Whereas certainly from this framework, subjectivity is embraced. It's not seen as being biased. biased. It's seen as being part of being human, and that it would, if you didn't have the feelings and the attitudes and the values dimension, it would be quite robotic. And potentially, students would actually respond negatively to that, because there's quite a bit of research in education that says that well-functioning classrooms are classrooms in which everyone, including the teacher, is a fully functioning human being. They don't leave their personality at the door and that kind of thing. And so there's quite a bit of research about that, which I think is interesting. Some people have a different view, of course. All right. And some other questions there, but we'll move on. So these are a couple of really interesting examples of critical reflection from health, particularly from nursing. And this uses the distinction between reflection on action and reflection in action. And reflection on action tends to be of the moment or in the moment, whereas reflection in action, typically it has a more retrospective dimension to it. And clearly, you're doing both. People are almost hardwired again to do both, to reflect in the situation, in situ, but also afterwards. So basically, very quickly, a scenario where Helen is the night shift nurse, or nurse in charge, or sister in charge, or whatever, and she is very angry when she finds that her patient is has an abdominal wound that hasn't been attended to, and so on. And so Helen informs the patient she's going to find Amy, the day nurse, and then to provide the wound care and so on. So Helen races off. She's angry. She's concerned that Amy has neglected the patient's care needs. And then Helen finds Amy at the nurse's station and says, what's your problem? You've been working on this unit for years. You can't prioritize your patient's care needs and provide him with necessary wound care. It's a good thing you don't work my shift. So I can just imagine Helen, and I can also imagine some supervising teachers who have that kind of attitude and behavior and so on. So reflection on action. Amy is completely bamboozled by all of this. She's not expecting this. She leaves the area frustrated and embarrassed. She is, now it says she neglects to inform Helen, but I think she's scared of Helen, or she's overwhelmed by Helen, or intimidated by Helen, that she doesn't feel able to say, actually, this is what the situation is. And so what actually happened was, Amy is actually a good nurse. She didn't abandon the poor patient, but she was called to the emergency room, which those of you who work in health would be very familiar with, to assist in providing trauma care. And so obviously that was a higher priority. And she, I don't know if that's a formal triaging process, but to me that's similar to the principle of triage, where you make an in situ decision about what you're going to do and so on. And so on her drive home, she reflects on that and moral distress, which is a very strong statement. So that's reflection on action. Now, reflection in action. So same scenario, same critical incident. Helen is still angry. Helen still seeks Amy out. But in this reflection in action, Amy gets in first. So she's proactive. She's mentally exhausted from the shift. She's been helping out with trauma emergency. So what she does, she sees Helen approaching, and before Helen can say a word, Amy draws a deep breath and says, Helen, I'm so sorry for the delay. I was called to assist with a multi-victim trauma emergency an hour ago, and I've only just got back. I'm on my way to change the dressing before I clock off, although I get the impression that Amy is actually, her duty is already finished. Her shift is finished. I'm not in the habit of giving my shift report until all my patients' needs have been met, which is the reason for any miscommunication. Now, they're the two scenarios, and again, people in health know much more about this. First of all, I think it's a very authentic critical incident or critical reflection situation to write about. What intrigued me about that, again, at a personal level, is that although I've never have, and no doubt never will be a nurse and all of that responsibility, I wouldn't have done either of those things. So I think that in the first one, Amy is rendered mute. She has no voice at all. In the second one, she has a voice, but in my view, it's a little bit too apologetic. Now, those of you who are work in health and nursing and so on may say, Patrick, you don't know what you're talking about. That's the hierarchy. That's how people, presumably Helen, I don't know, but it seems to me Helen has a more senior position, or maybe she's just got a stronger personality. So although I feel that this kind of takes the wind out of Helen's sails and makes the point very professionally and so on, in a sense, to me, part of the issue here is Helen's behavior, which is likely to continue regardless of these two scenarios. No, I may be quite wrong. The beauty of this kind of thing is that it's a critical reflection where there are no predetermined answers. There's no one right way to respond to that. And good that someone is engaging with that. And I know that Alison is kindly monitoring the chat, so that's good. So I don't seek to offend anyone. It's just my reflection as someone from a different discipline. All right, so let's think for a moment about why do so many academics and across so many disciplines set critical reflections as an assessment of learning task? Well, these are some of the reasons. This is from Charles Sturt University, Division of Teaching and Learning. First of all, that it supports student development as reflective practitioners. It's an authentic form of assessment. And so those of you familiar with this would recognize this as saying it is a very good assessment of learning, but it's also a very good assessment for learning. In other words, critical reflections, when they're done well, help us to really extend our understanding, deepen our knowledge of what can be very complex professional fields and practice fields and so on. It can be assessed through a range of different outputs, obviously in writing, but also video, audio, or PowerPoint presentations like today, all kinds of things. It can promote creativity and originality, depending on how you approach the task. It can be a link to future employability. So before I mentioned the competencies that most, if not all, professions require in their pre-service courses to be accredited and that kind of thing. It does promote deep thinking about the learning. So metacognitive, that is actually thinking about the thinking, cognition about the cognition. So, and it aligns with learning outcomes and cognitive processes that are related to demonstrating all of these kinds of things. And some of those you'll recognize from Bloom's taxonomy, which is it's quite dated, and I know he had an updated version and so on, but it's still there, including judgment, evaluation, synthesis, and so on. So it's all there. All right, so we'll move on. Now, this is a really good graphic. And I think, again, I thank Alison for sending that through, but it's also related to my slight provocation, which when you hear, you may think is not a provocation at all. But anyway, one of the beautiful things about this graphic is that it links really well through these organizing questions, these 12 dimensions of reflective practice overall. So in other words, it links critical reflection as being a subset of a broader field called reflective practice. And so you've got, and this was the think, feel, do, not dichotomy, but classification or taxonomy that I mentioned before. And so you've got past experience, you've got current understanding, you've got your critical reflection, and then a change to practice. And so the current understanding we're likely to have anyway as thinking, feeling, doing human beings. The beauty of and the function of the critical reflection is to make this current understanding explicit and open to analysis and open to challenge, open to questioning and so on, which is really good. So this is where the provocation comes in, the change to practice. So these three questions: what do I think I will do differently as a result of my critical reflection? What are my feelings about changing my practice? And what will I do differently in my practice based on my critical reflection? And I'm pretty confident, regardless of the discipline and profession you work in, that the critical reflection is likely to have an element of this projected change. What will I change? How will I change? Why will I change? But this is the provocation. Change to practice, what do you think? So this is from the University of Waterloo in Canada. Critical reflection is not a reading assignment, it's not a summary of an activity, and it's not an emotional outlet. So obviously you draw on your experiential knowledge, but it's not meant to be, oh, I feel, depressed, sad, whatever about this. It can have that affective dimension, but it's meant to be more than that. Interestingly, rather, the goal is to change your thinking about a subject and thus change your behavior. And it's that part that I'm a bit ambivalent about, shall we say. So there are certainly times when we're likely to wish to change our behavior as a direct result of our critical reflection about an issue. Absolutely. And if we define behavior, change to behavior, as including thinking and understanding, although some people would disagree with that, then that's fine. However, there may well be situations where our behavior, if understood as being direct or explicit action, might not actually change, or at least not in the short term. In other words, reflection is contemplation. So, from my perspective, you can still have critical reflection that is contemplative, but that does not always automatically, inevitably involve direct change, at least in the short term. Now, that may be seen as wildly provocative, or it might be seen as ho-hum and, well, that's obvious, which is fine. All right, so I'm conscious of the time, and I do want to leave a bit of time for discussion, so we'll keep going. Now, this is actually the last main section of the presentation, and so it's how to write critical reflections from the University of Sydney this time, their excellent learning centre. Now, one of the things is to think about, again going back to definitions, how is reflection different from reflective practice, different from critical self-reflection? And so when you consider, critical self-reflection, when you consider how you are situated within broader social and institutional contexts, and to identify assumptions that you've not been aware of, challenging questions and assumptions. So that's the critical dimension that we go back to. Now, again, apologies for the reading, but basically very quickly, it's really to encourage you to, by a timely reminder, that critical reflection has other elements within it, and usually starting with description and then analysis and then the critical dimension. Now, sometimes those are more difficult to separate in practice, but it's actually very difficult, maybe impossible, to have a critical reflection without a descriptive element. We need to know what's going on, whether that's a critical incident or whether that's a scenario or whatever it might be. We need to have that description. Now, if you've only got 300 words, 500 words, the description has to be proportionate to that, but it needs to be there. You need to show your understanding as concisely as possible what's going on. Then you bring in the analysis, and then you bring in the critical dimension. Now, again, apologies for that, but that's an example of a critical reflection in social work. And basically, there's a young person called Max, and he's in trouble at school, and so Max is there, and it's an intervention. And so there are the school principal, the counselor, the youth worker, family members, and then there's Max. Now, I don't know Max at all, but I feel a bit sorry for him, because after half an hour, he starts to get a bit agitated and says, "This is boring and I don't want to do this anymore." If I were Max, I'd probably not last 30 minutes. But anyway, be that as it may. So this is a reflection, which is, when you look at it, if you go and have a look at the PowerPoints later, it's actually quite sequentially developed. So there's description, there's analysis, and then there's, when I reflect on these, the themes and so on, or patterns emerging out of the situation. So that's a good example of a critical reflection from social work. One from education again. So this is from a lesson plan. This lesson took much longer than I thought, and so on. And so this is really reflecting on Year 8 students. This again, it's easy to I'm not being critical. This is taken out of context, all the rest of it, but it's basically saying the year 8 students typically, even stereotypically, are at the stage of egocentrism, and so this is really important. They're doing identity work, and so we need to build on that and help them to move away from that, drawing on Erickson. And then another one from business studies. So this is someone reflecting as a team member, which I find really interesting. And so there's discounting as a behavior, not in terms of businesses, but rather as people in groups. And so I use discounting involves devaluing the ideas and opinions of other group members due to a self-belief, possibly in a competitive environment. So I don't know in the group work whether each student got a different mark or whether they just got a group mark. But anyway, this student engaging in self-reflection, I use discounting sporadically, only with the aim of achieving the highest level of success in the task at hand. So that's very honest of the person. And I guess that then what's happening here is that they're really teasing out. So why did I behave like that? And why might that be questionable as a hidden value of individualism and so on? So it's just another example from a different discipline of a critical reflection. All right, I will finish on this. I really wish all of you well. Critical reflections can be frustrating or, terrifying or whatever, overwhelming. They're not meant to be, but particularly drawing on your judgment and being confident in your own judgment, but also using exemplars and skills of writing and so on will certainly set you up well for writing excellent and effective critical reflections. Okay, and so I'll stop there.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Patrick. Yeah, do students have comments or some questions they would like to ask Patrick about that presentation? Okay, Pip has to go. There were some few good comments from about your nursing example. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Alison. I'm reading those, and yes, it's very interesting that my outsider view resonates with a number of you, including Kate and Zoom user. I don't know who that is, and so on. So that's really interesting. And look, the same thing as in teaching. I've seen some terrible things. And about eating one's young and so on. So I guess just reflecting on that for a moment, if you're in that situation, that's so the saying that nurses eat their own is, I've heard before, as a non-nurse, non-health person, I've certainly heard that from nurses and so on. And I guess at one level that's anecdotal knowledge. It's empirical knowledge. Other people have certainly had that, and it may well be that some of the people sharing here have also had that experience directly. But then, of course, the point about the critical reflection is to investigate a bit further. Why is that so? And what are the consequences? And are there any counter narratives? And am I being too hard on Amy? Is reflection in action the best that she could have done, given the power differential and so on? And wake up, Patrick, you couldn't have done any better than that, which is fine. That's part of a critical reflection, make us challenge and question our own taken for granted assumptions.
There's also a question from Thor there about how does one write a critical reflection in a way that illustrates transparency?
Mm-hmm.
Is it in the structure?
Thanks.
Good question, Thor.
Yes, indeed, Thor. That's very mind concentrating. Excellent question. Look, I think it's in terms of transparency, yes. In a sense, the external facing is the structure, the wording that you use, the signposting that you would put. So the signposting might be some of the academic theory that you're drawing on and so on. But I guess the transparency part of it in one way is the authenticity, and only the writer knows whether they're actually doing it genuinely, or in a sense making it up. But as a reader of these texts in education, often we know the students because we're often assessing their work, and we have a sense from discussions, class discussions, or their conversations with us, whether, where they're really digging down to what they really feel and so on. So
Mm,
not sure if that really addresses it all, but yeah,
mm.
thank you.
I guess it's also about like, does it provoke insight?
Yes,
Does it yeah,
yes.
I don't know how to explain that. Just those
Ah,
steps that you gave were excellent. And like, do we gain insight or greater awareness
mm.
uh, through a scenario? Yeah.
That's right, Alison. I guess what that's great. And one of the tests there, of course, is whether someone who's old and jaded and maybe cynical and so on, who's read lots of these, comes across something and think, oh, wow, stops them in their tracks. I've never thought about that. Of course, not everyone can do that every time, but we can certainly craft it based on Thor's question. We can craft it in a way that really gets to the essence of what we think. And part of that is the discipline of the logic with which we present the ideas and that kind of thing. And transparency includes clarity of thinking and that kind of thing. So absolutely.
Um, okay, I'm just posting in the chat box our next workshop with Patrick, and he's going to in a couple of weeks do another workshop with us, writing an excellent critical review. It's also aimed at masters and coursework students, but all students are welcome. And that's more about assessing your resources, how to evaluate journal articles, books, and so forth. So that's a very useful workshop to come to as well. Might just post that link in if people are interested in registering for that one. So Patrick, you are happy to share the PowerPoints later, which is
Yes, that's
useful for students, I think, to actually have a look at examples of those written critical reflections. So excellent. Thank you.
absolutely. Thanks. And I'm sure you do this, Alison, anyway. If anyone comes across other resources, it's good to share those, isn't it? To build up a repository, because we all learn from that.
Yes, that's true. Excellent idea. Okay, anyone else got some comments or questions as we're finishing up with Patrick today? Thank you. Informative. Excellent. Thanks. Thanks so much, Thor. Good to see you. Well, I think everyone's gone quiet, Patrick.
So hopefully not a stunned silence. No, look, it's great. Really, really appreciate it, Alison, and everyone. And much appreciation, and have a terrific day.
Thank you. Thank you.